United States Navy commissioned its first nuclear-powered submarine on the last day of September 1954, and the vessel promptly embarrassed every diesel-electric boat in the fleet without firing a single weapon. During early exercises, the USS Nautilus, hull number 571, held a sustained submerged speed that conventional submarines simply could not match and could not escape. Surface task forces practicing anti-submarine warfare found their tactics suddenly obsolete. Destroyers that had trained for years to prosecute contacts using doctrine refined in the Second World War discovered that this new boat could outrun their best sprint speed while remaining submerged indefinitely. The torpedo attack geometry changed completely. The rules that every submariner, every escort commander, and every naval war planner had internalized since 1945 had to be thrown away and rewritten. That is not a metaphor. It is what actually happened. What made this so jarring was not just the speed, though the speed was genuinely startling. It was the permanence of the capability. A conventional submarine of the early 1950s could achieve respectable underwater sprint speeds for perhaps an hour before its battery charge was critically depleted, forcing it to surface or snorkel and expose itself to radar detection. The Nautilus simply kept going. Its reactor did not care about battery state, fuel oil reserves, or proximity to a resupply port. The engineering logic that had governed submarine warfare since the earliest Holland-type boats, the fundamental trade-off between submerged endurance and surface vulnerability, had been abolished by a single design decision made in a reactor laboratory in Idaho. Understanding how that happened and what it cost and what it ultimately produced for naval doctrine worldwide requires going back much further than the commissioning ceremony in Groton, Connecticut. The strategic pressure that created the Nautilus was not entirely born from the Cold War, though the Cold War absolutely accelerated it. The underlying problem was one that had troubled submarine designers since the First World War. A submarine is defined by its ability to disappear, but conventional propulsion systems are fundamentally incompatible with true invisibility. Diesel engines require atmospheric oxygen, which means they require access to the surface or near-surface environment through a snorkel mast. Even the most sophisticated German Type 21 U-boats of 1944 and 45, which represented the absolute peak of conventional submarine technology at the time, were limited to roughly 17 knots submerged for about an hour, dropping to 5 knots or less for sustained endurance. The moment speed dropped, tactical opportunity evaporated. A submarine that cannot close the range on a target or cannot sprint clear of an escort screen is a submarine that depends on ambush from a fixed position. That is a fundamentally defensive and inflexible posture. By the late 1940s, the United States Navy was watching the Soviet Union absorb German submarine technology, including recovered Type 21 designs and their engineers, and integrate it into a shipbuilding program of alarming scale. Soviet submarine construction was proceeding at rates that dwarfed anything the Americans had achieved, even during wartime mobilization. The Project 613. Whiskey-class boats, heavily influenced by captured German designs, were rolling out of Soviet yards by the dozens. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Navy would operate the largest submarine fleet in the world, numerically overwhelming NATO anti-submarine warfare forces. The conventional American response, building more diesel-electric submarines of incrementally improved design, simply could not address that numerical disadvantage. The only logical counter was a qualitative leap so profound that numbers became less relevant. If each American submarine was so capable individually that it could hunt and destroy multiple Soviet boats in a single patrol, the arithmetic of the Cold War arms race changed fundamentally. Nuclear propulsion was the mechanism that could deliver that qualitative advantage. The man most directly responsible for translating that strategic logic into steel and uranium was Captain Hyman Rickover, an officer whose personality was so abrasive and whose methods were so unorthodox that the Navy repeatedly considered ending his career before ultimately concluding that no one else could do what he was doing. Rickover did not invent nuclear fission, and he did not design the reactor that powered the Nautilus from scratch. What he did was apply an engineer's obsessive discipline to the problem of making a naval reactor reliable, compact, safe, and ultimately producible at scale. He spent years at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and worked directly with Westinghouse Electric to develop what became the submarine thermal reactor, the pressurized water reactor design that formed the basis of the S-2W plant installed in the Nautilus. His key insight was that the Navy did not need the most powerful reactor theoretically conceivable. It needed the most reliable reactor that could actually be built, maintained, and operated by human beings in a cramped, moving, high-stress environment. If detailed technical breakdowns of naval architecture and maritime strategy interest you, subscribe. I have got more of these coming. The S-2W reactor plant, as installed in Nautilus, used enriched uranium fuel in a pressurized water configuration. The primary coolant loop carried heat from the reactor core under high pressure, which prevented the water from boiling despite temperatures far above the normal boiling point. That primary loop transferred heat through steam generators to a secondary loop, which produced the steam that drove the turbines, which turned the shafts. The separation between the radioactive primary loop and the non-radioactive secondary loop was a critical safety feature, and it also meant that the turbine machinery itself was not contaminated, simplifying maintenance enormously. The pressurized water reactor design Rickover championed became the template not just for American submarines, but for the nuclear-powered surface combatants that followed, and ultimately for the commercial nuclear power industry worldwide. That is a legacy that extends well beyond the waterline. The physical dimensions of Nautilus reflect the engineering reality of fitting that reactor plant into a working submarine hull. The boat measured approximately 97 meters in length with a beam of just over 8 meters, displacing roughly 3,530 tons surfaced and 4,090 tons submerged. Those figures place it in roughly the same displacement class as late-war American fleet submarines like the Gato class, which is significant because Nautilus was not dramatically larger than its predecessors. The reactor plant was substantial, but Rickover's team had worked hard to keep it compact, and the basic teardrop-adjacent hull form, while not yet the fully optimized teardrop shape that would come with the USS Albacore experimental hull, was capable enough to allow the power plant to express itself fully in terms of speed. The vessel could achieve in excess of 23 knots submerged, which in 1954 was an almost incomprehensible figure. For comparison, the fastest torpedoes in service at the time could only reliably engage targets at speeds significantly slower than that, raising immediate questions about whether existing weapon systems could even effectively arm such a fast platform. The machinery spaces demanded by a nuclear plant introduced crew habitability challenges that had nothing to do with radiation and everything to do with noise and heat. The steam turbine and reduction gear arrangement necessary to convert reactor heat into shaft rotation produced a mechanical noise signature that was significant by later standards. Early crews aboard Nautilus described the engineering spaces as genuinely loud environments during high-speed runs, and the thermal management of a reactor compartment in a sealed pressure hull created temperatures that made watch standing in certain spaces physically demanding. The forward torpedo room and crew berthing areas were comparatively comfortable, and Nautilus was actually designed with significantly better habitability standards than most diesel-electric boats of the era, partly because the unlimited endurance meant crews might actually be at sea long enough for conditions to matter psychologically. The old calculus of diesel submarine operations, where the boat surfaced regularly and the crew got fresh air and natural light, no longer applied. Nautilus proved early that nuclear submarine crews needed better food, better lighting, and better sleeping arrangements, not out of luxury, but out of operational necessity. The armament of Nautilus was conventional by the standards of the day, consisting of 6 533mm bow torpedo tubes with a wartime loadout of conventional heavyweight torpedoes. There was no attempt to integrate the nuclear propulsion plant with any new weapons concept at the design stage, a deliberate choice that reflected Rickover's philosophy of solving one overwhelming engineering problem at a time. The Mark 14 torpedo and its successors were carried in the standard configuration. What the propulsion system changed was not what weapons the submarine carried, but how it could employ them. A nuclear submarine can sprint to a firing position, launch and sprint clear at speeds that make the entire attack geometry fundamentally different from anything a diesel-electric platform could execute. The combination of speed and endurance meant that Nautilus could theoretically intercept a surface task force at a point of the submarine commander's choosing rather than being forced into a static ambush dictated by battery limitations. That tactical freedom was worth more than any incremental improvement in torpedo performance. The navigation achievement that permanently secured Nautilus's place in history came in August of 1958, when Commander William Anderson took the boat beneath the Arctic ice pack and transited from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean by passing under the geographic North Pole. Operation Sunshine, as it was designated, was not primarily a scientific expedition. It was a demonstration of global reach that had direct and immediate military implications. A submarine that could transit beneath the Arctic ice, invisible to radar, and acoustically difficult to track, could threaten Soviet port cities and naval bases from vectors that existing Soviet anti-submarine warfare capabilities were completely unprepared to address. The transit took 96 hours from the Bering Strait to the Greenland Sea, covering roughly 1,830 nautical miles under the ice. The crew did not surface. They did not snorkel. The reactor simply ran. That single transit reshaped geopolitical thinking about maritime reach in a way that no peacetime naval demonstration had managed since Alfred Thayer Mahan was writing about sea power in the 1890s. Knowing what you now know about how that reactor plant transformed both the tactics and the strategic reach of submarine operations, do you think the engineering trade-offs and the program's extraordinary cost were worth the outcome? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The Arctic transit also exposed limitations that were as important as the capabilities it demonstrated. Nautilus operated under the ice without an under-ice sonar capability that was fully adequate to the task. The navigation system used was dead reckoning supplemented by inertial systems of limited accuracy. Commander Anderson and his crew were navigating in a world without global positioning system satellites, without reliable under-ice charts of adequate detail, and without the emergency surface options available in open water. Ice keels, the downward projections of pressure ridges that can extend tens of meters below the surface, were a constant threat to the sail and masts. These were real dangers, not abstract ones. The ice transit identified a list of specific technological deficiencies that the Navy subsequently invested heavily in correcting, including improved under-ice sonar, the ship's inertial navigation system, and the development of specially reinforced sail structures for subsequent nuclear submarines designed to operate in Arctic environments routinely. The Nautilus pointed at the future and simultaneously illuminated everything that still needed to be built to get there. The acoustic signature problem that plagued Nautilus throughout its operational life became the defining engineering challenge of the next 30 years of American submarine design. The mechanical noise produced by the S2W plant, the steam turbines, the reduction gearing, and the various auxiliary pumps and systems required to support reactor operations created a sound profile that, while not catastrophic in the early 1950s when Soviet detection technology was also primitive, would have become increasingly problematic as hydrophone arrays improved. The SOSUS network, the sound surveillance system, was a fixed underwater hydrophone array the United States was deploying across the Atlantic and Pacific during the same period that Nautilus was entering service. what the Americans could build to track Soviet submarines, the Soviets could eventually build to track American ones, and the acoustic vulnerability of early nuclear submarines was a recognized problem almost from the first deep-water trials. The response was a decades-long program of isolation mounting for machinery, anechoic hull coating research, natural circulation reactor designs, and ultimately the extraordinary quieting achieved in the Los Angeles-class and later Seawolf-class submarines. None of that would have happened with the urgency it did without Nautilus defining the requirement through its own operational experience. The reactor refueling cycle was another area where the operational reality differed from the theoretical promise in ways that shaped subsequent procurement thinking. Nautilus was designed to operate on its initial fuel core for a significant period, but early reactors were not yet optimized to the degree that later generations achieved. The first core lasted approximately 2 years of operation before requiring replacement, a process that required extensive yard time and specialized facilities. By the standards of later American nuclear submarines, which might go a decade or more between refueling periods, and by the extraordinary standard of the Virginia-class boats, designed with reactor fuel loads intended to last the entire service life of the hull, the early refueling cycles of Nautilus represented significant operational overhead. The Electric Boat Company facilities at Groton, which built and later maintained the vessel, had to develop entirely new industrial procedures for handling spent nuclear fuel in a naval shipyard context. That knowledge base, accumulated through Nautilus and the small class of early nuclear submarines that followed, became the institutional foundation of the entire naval nuclear propulsion program's maintenance infrastructure. The decommissioning of Nautilus in 1980 represented the end of active service for a vessel that had been technologically superseded so thoroughly by its own descendants that it was by that point more museum piece than warship. The boat was formally retired and eventually towed to Groton, where it was preserved as a National Historic Landmark and remains accessible to the public as the Submarine Force Museum. That preservation decision was itself significant, an acknowledgement that Nautilus was not merely another decommissioned hull, but a physical artifact of a technological inflection point as important in naval history as the transition from sail to steam in the 19th century. Walking the length of that pressure hull today, moving through the cramped control room with its analog instruments and hand wheels, it is genuinely difficult to reconcile the modest physical reality of the vessel with the magnitude of its impact. The machinery is quiet now. The reactor has been defueled, but the decisions made in those compartments and the lessons absorbed from every dive and transit and exercise reverberate through every nuclear-powered vessel operating anywhere in the world right now. The legacy of the Nautilus is ultimately a story about engineering discipline meeting strategic vision at exactly the right moment. Rickover's insistence on safety culture, on documentation, on training standards that bordered on obsessive, on the principle that a reactor operator must understand not just procedures, but underlying physics, created an institutional culture within the naval nuclear propulsion program that has maintained an extraordinary safety record across more than 6 decades and hundreds of reactors. No American nuclear-powered naval vessel has ever suffered a reactor accident resulting in a release of radioactive material. That record is not an accident. It is the direct product of the standards Rickover established, while Nautilus was still being designed, tested, and driven hard through Atlantic exercises. The French Navy, the British Royal Navy, the Soviet and then Russian Navy, and the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy all followed the nuclear submarine path that Nautilus blazed, each with varying degrees of success and varying safety outcomes. The divergence in those outcomes reflects, in part, the divergence in the institutional cultures surrounding nuclear propulsion that each nation developed. The Nautilus did not just change how submarines were built, it changed what navies believed was possible. Before the first underway message sent by Commander Eugene Wilkinson on January 17, 1955, reading simply, Underway on nuclear power, the concept of a vessel that could remain submerged for weeks, cross oceans beneath the surface, and outrun every conventional platform hunting it, was a theoretical aspiration. After that message, it was engineering reality. Every Trident submarine carrying ballistic missiles in silent patrol beneath the North Atlantic. Every fast attack submarine running intelligence missions under Arctic ice. Every nuclear-powered aircraft carrier projecting power across the Pacific traces a direct and unbroken technological lineage back to that single reactor plant in a gray hull at Groton in 1954. If you found this analysis useful, a like helps more people discover these deep dives, and I genuinely appreciate you spending the time with this material. Thanks for watching.